Hello, stranger. What a day. You look bored. I can fix that.
Thanks to my friendly local game store, I managed to snag a copy of the Champions of Slaanesh box. I'm primarily a Chaos Army enjoyer, so I couldn't pass up the chance of getting the Emperor's Children. I went outside, God forbid, and drove to my friendly local game store. Once I got there, the employee saw me when I opened the door and immediately pulled out the box from underneath the cash, without me even asking for it. I asked if they needed my ID or anything, and their response was, "Don't worry, I know who you are." I guess I've hit regular status there. And after inhaling some A&W, I headed home and got to the unboxing. After admiring the box art and fancy packaging, I gave a quick look through the contents. Now that the dopamine hit is officially worn off, I really saw what work I had in store for me. 15 sprues and 33 models. And there's no better time to start than right now, so let's get cooking. I knew this was going to be a long and tedious process, so I wanted to eat dessert first and build the Lord Exultant. Thankfully, these more modern GW kits don't have as bad mold lines as some of their older kits, but they're still there, so I want to make sure I remove them first. After cutting them out and selecting the war gear, I got to assembling. For the glue, this time I used Mr. Hobby Cement S. Unfortunately, I ran out of my usual Tamiya Extra Thin after multiple spill incidents, so I grabbed this as a backup. I find this one evaporates a lot quicker than the Tamiya stuff, but it still gets the job done. I think going forward, Mr. Hobby Cement might work better for cleaning up sanding and cut marks on plastic, since it's less heavy than Tamiya and it evaporates pretty quickly. Once he was all built up, I put him aside and moved on to the main infantry. You get enough sprues to build 2 squads of 10. You can build them either as infractors or tormentors, so I decided to do both to get some variety. Also, a side note, am I nuts, or is a full squad of 10 infantry with precision on all their weapons kind of insane? Anyway, my best bet for getting all these guys built in any sort of efficient way is to batch build them. This means getting all the bodies cut out, cleaned, then the heads, the shoulders, and etc. That way by the end I'm just left with a big pile of completed parts that I can just glue together. These guys are somewhat monopose since their legs and torso all kind of make one piece, that you just have to glue their backs onto. Once I got all 20 of those cleaned and glued, I got the heads and the shoulders ready. These didn't take too long since they were much smaller and didn't have any complex mold lines. Finally, I clipped out all the weapons, the arms, and the backpacks. This left me with a huge pile of limbs that I could finally just assemble. I broke out the glue again and got to putting them together. 1 pint of Guinness later and all 33 models were magically assembled. I left the heads blue tacked on, that way I could remove them for easier painting later. I also left the Lord Exultant's cape separate as well since I have some extra plans for that first. This process was tedious, but seeing them all lined up this way is really satisfying. Alright, 5 days in and not an ounce of paint has touched these models yet. As the days go on, I can slowly see the title of this video becoming accidental clickbait. But, we gotta carry on regardless. I wanted to give his cape a bit more flair with some sculpting. I also wanted a redo with green stuff since my last attempts didn't exactly go so well. I kit bashed this World Eater's Master of Executions years ago and wanted to give him a cape. Not only was my first attempt at sculpting this complete ass, but the last batch of green stuff I had must have gone bad or something. It was really hard to work with and you can even see unmixed clumps of putty still mixed into the cape. I didn't want to give up on green stuff though, so I bought a fresh batch from a different company, and I could already tell this worked so much better. A tip for green stuff is to cut off the part in the middle where the 2 halves join first. Green stuff is an epoxy putty, which means it has a resin and a hardener, in this case shown by the 2 different colors. When the 2 halves are touched and get mixed together, they form a chemical reaction that hardens like a rock. I used a lot of epoxy putties when studying prop design in college, and I'll always remember that our professors would really drill into us not to touch the 2 parts together until you were working with it. So it kind of blows my mind that green stuff is sold this way. Again, the rest of the putty is fine, but it is kind of a waste that the middle strip always has to be thrown out. Anyway, that's been my daily dose of actually getting some use out of my college certificate. Back to sculpting. I mixed the 2 halves together 50-50 until I didn't see any trace of blue or yellow left in the putty. That means it's good to go and the chemical reaction is already taking place. I wanted to make his cape look like it was made out of fur, so I would rip off little teardrop shapes and stick them onto the desired parts of the model. This stuff is super sticky, so I wet my cutting mat a bit to help the putty not stick to my fingers as much. The best way I found to sculpt this effect was to go left to right, row by row, starting from the bottom, and then slightly overlapping each row above the last. This will give it a lot more volume. Now that all the assembly and minor kit bashing is done, I wanted to get started on their bases. I wanted to go for something kind of rough and sharp, almost like a crater. I found these slate rocks at the local craft store and thought these would be perfect. I glued them down with some hot glue, pointing the inclines outward of the bases to kind of create like a crater effect. Literally after doing one base, I immediately realized the hot glue just was not sticking to these rocks at all and they completely fell off. With the want to just get these bases done, I broke out the old reliables instead, cork and bark chips. I ripped up the cork similar to the jagged shapes of the slate rocks and then glued them on, again making the inclines point outward. I didn't have as much space to do this on the 32mm bases, so I glued in some smaller chunks and broke out my Dremel sander to flatten the middle. This created a very subtle incline effect. Dremels are a great way to reshape materials like cork. It does make a mess though, so make sure you have a way to contain everything that's going to fly everywhere. Once I was satisfied with the cork and bark, I broke out another 2-part putty, milliput. Unlike green stuff, which dries kind of soft and bendy, milliput dries rock hard, no bendability. That makes it greater for bulkier builds like bases. I wedged small balls of putty wherever there was a gap between the cork, using a spare piece of cork to stamp the similar texture into the putty. This will help blend the pieces of cork together more once everything is painted. Sometimes little crumbs of cork will fall off and get stamped into the putty as well, which is kind of a happy accident. It'll only add more texture when we do our dry brushing later. I wanted to give the pieces of cork more stability, as cork's pretty soft and prone to bending and paint chipping. I was recommended to try brushing on some satin varnish to harden it. It somewhat did, but it didn't make it as rock hard as I needed it to be. The other option was extra thin super glue. That did the trick much better. Fair warning though, when you use a lot of this stuff, it smells, especially on materials like cork and bark. There's something in the wood that causes a chemical reaction with the super glue that causes it to get really hot, and sometimes it'll even start smoking, so just be kind of cautious where you're doing this. Once I let the super glue finish drying, I did one last texture addition and used some Citadel texture paste. When this stuff dries, it starts to separate, causing a cracked earth effect. The thicker you put the stuff on, the larger the cracks are. So it's kind of good to vary the thickness of when you're applying this stuff. There's one thing I forgot to do earlier, which was add some chain to the Lord Exultant. I cut out some jewelry chain and found a place to dangle it to look good. I found hanging it from the chest ornament to the underside of the front shoulder pad could look pretty cool. I superglued it in place and finally moved on to priming. I felt like the bases were actually missing one last texture, so I broke out some mixed grain sand. I applied the stuff to the base, sprinkling it loosely, fixing it down with some extra thin super glue. This stuff is as thin as water, so it's really easy to cover all the sand at once without missing any spots. And now that we're going to start priming, I superglued all the models to their bases. Boy, 1 week, huh? Day 8 and I've only now started painting. Thankfully the base colors of these guys will all be airbrushed, so that should save me some time, but woof. After getting these guys primed up with some Vallejo black primer, I picked out the color recipe for my armor. I went for a very bright, vibrant pink for these guys. The Games Workshop color scheme is nice, but I don't really think it fits the vibe of the Emperor's Children. When I think of the Emperor's Children in Slaanesh, I think vibrant, over the top, almost glam rock to some degree. So I want my paint scheme to kind of reflect that. My painting style is definitely more on the grimy, weathered side of things, so this is really going to be out of my comfort zone, but I kind of wanted to try something different for these guys. Hopefully it works out. After testing my scheme on this good old test marine, I got started. I started with a darker blue as the undercoat. I'm sticking to the blue to pink side of the color wheel for this. Painting them pink doesn't literally just mean only use pink. Using other colors as your undercoat that are close to pink on the spectrum can really make your scheme look a lot more interesting. So the blues and purples as an undercoat should give a nice transition from the cool, colder colors up to the hot, loud pinks that I'll be using after. The more paint I use, the more I treat each one like a controlled zenithal. I paint each color only from above, hitting the highest points of the model. With each color, I cover less and less of the model, essentially doing all the base colored highlights without touching a brush. Since I had the airbrush out, I painted all the helmets with an off-white cream color. I grabbed some titanium white and dry brushed the helmets to make all the details pop a little more. After that, I superglued all the heads down to their bodies. I wanted to use a cream, almost royal white as a secondary color for their armor, so the shade that I wanted to use was a red tone that will tint the white to be a very pale pink. I wanted to use that same off-white on the trim as well. I started with a basic flat white that I would shade down later. I painted armor trim before, even chaos armor trim, but man, the Emperor's Children trim is on another level. There's trim on everything. It was so much to the point where I kind of had to decide which trim I would be painting and which I would just kind of ignore and leave pink. Otherwise I'd be here for months. Once I got the shoulders done, I made another decision that would definitely add a lot more time to the process. Instead of doing white trim on the bottom, I would kind of reverse the color scheme and paint the legs white from the knees down. I tried doing this with a brush on one of the models and quickly remembered why painting white is so hated by hobbyists. It does not cover well with a brush, and I'm not gonna lie, committing to hand painting 33 models worth of flat surfaces with a brush, I'm not doing that. So instead of being smart and using this as a learning opportunity, I took the easy way out. If you want to call making more work for myself the easy way out. I ran to the store and bought some liquid latex. This stuff is great if you really want to do precise masking for painting. I poured some out and used a disposable brush to cover all of the thigh and waist armor so that none of the white paint spills over where I don't want it to. I didn't bother masking from the waist up since I know the airbrush can spray fine enough where it wouldn't really have any overspray. Once the latex was dry, I broke out the airbrush and painted all the legs with white paint. I tried to be as careful and controlled as possible just to make sure I don't accidentally overspray onto anything else. Once I let the paint dry, I started peeling off the masking latex. I used tweezers to pull it out of the deeper recesses, then I used a ball of double stick tape to pull off the larger areas. It was tedious and took a while, but I think I got the look I wanted, and this was probably the best approach for it. Can't have Emperor's Children without any flashy gold, so I painted all of the symbols and decorations with it. The first gold I used wasn't really covering too well, so I tried switching to Citadel Gehenna's gold. All the head ornaments, shoulder emblems, and leg trim got a treatment of gold. Once that was done, I used some black speed paint to cover all of the under armor. I usually use speed paints for these parts because those areas tend to be a bit harder to reach, so the flowiness and good coverage of speed paint is a great way to get these done fast. I still had some gold bits left and I wanted to try a new paint that I got. I love Pro Acryl's titanium white, so I wanted to try one of their other colors as well. I mainly used this gold on the guns. The guns have almost as much trim and decor as the armor, so this took just as long to paint. The gold covered pretty well, but I found it wasn't as rich as the other tones that I was using. One solution I had for this was to use a gold speed paint over top it. Not only did this give it a nice rich tone, but it also acted as a second coat for the first coat that I used already. I used this gold speed paint over all the gold trim I had already painted. This really made it pop a lot more and match the gold I had already painted on the armor. I used some lead belcher to coat the body of the weapons. I gave them all a coat of that and followed it up with some Nuln Oil. This really helped dull down the shine a bit and made them look more used and oily. Since I had the washes out already, I used some Agrax Earthshade and all of the gold. Gold base coats with Agrax Earthshade is always such a nice combination for making your gold really pop. It has great contrast with the bright gold, and the warmer brown tone really helps complement the gold. For the white trim, I wanted to use a more subtle shade than the one I used on the helmets. I grabbed some Karabog Crimson, watered it down a bit, and shaded the trim on the shoulders. Tried to keep it more contained to the concave parts of the trim, leaving the highest parts still bright white. Back to the gold on the guns. I wanted to experiment a little bit and try a different wash than Agrax Earthshade. I grabbed some Army Painter Red Tone and shaded the gold using that. And I gotta say, I'm so glad I tried this because the red shadow and the bright gold is really good looking. Not only does it make the gold look really rich, but the red also helps tie together the warmer pink tones of the armor. I used the same shade carefully around the gold trim on the legs as well. All that was left to base coat were any of the fabric bits like the helmet feathers and the capes. I grabbed a purple, red, and orange for these. I started basing them with a purple tone, making sure to not hit any of the gold parts with it. In hindsight, this would have been a lot easier if I didn't glue them down to their bases yet, but the theme of this so far has been making more work for myself than I need to, so I can't exactly stop there. Once the purple was done, I grabbed the red, watered it down, and roughly started painting it just on the higher parts of the purple. I wanted to treat the purple more of a shadow color, with the red and orange being their midtones and highlights. After that, I grabbed my orange and gave it a rough dry brush only on the high spots. The dry brush works great for this, it only hits the higher up parts of the sculpt. I finally used an orangey red wash to tie it all together. I did the same 4-step process in some of the other parts of the models that I initially missed, like the flayed flesh that some of the Marines have on their shoulders and forearms. After that, I finally felt like I was making some good progress. Sure, it's been over a few weeks already and I'm behind schedule, but for me this isn't too bad. Despite the setbacks, extreme burnout, and making more work for myself than I usually do, I think I can get this done. Well, flow of time really don't stop for anyone, does it? Alright, here's the thing. I got so burned out trying to get these guys done all at once. Batch painting is just not for me, so I think painting the same thing 33 times in a row quite literally broke my mind. Not only that, but I had a little... happened at the end of May, and I had to grind out a fully 3D printed cosplay in under a month. Yeah, so I'm back. If it's any consolation, I did buy more landfill to add to my backlog at the convention. Alright, now that I'm back, refreshed, spent out, I think it's high time I continue and try to get this video out before the summer. I started in March. Okay, first thing I wanted to do now that I had a 2-month hiatus from looking at these guys was add more highlights to the last parts that I painted. I grabbed some watery orange paint and stippled the highlights on the fleshy bits. This will really help it look more like a sickly yellow flesh. I did the same thing on the capes and the cloth parts as well. Through all that burnout and confusion, I just realized that the power packs have just been sitting off to the side, still just with their base coat. So I think it's time I bite the bullet and get those done as well. This time I wanted to try shading them first, as I don't have any trim to worry about getting extra paint on by accident. I used the same wash I used earlier and slopped it all over the power packs. Seeing the wash go on without any trim yet really made me realize how great this wash looks over bright pink. In fact, I liked it so much that I went back to all my models and washed all the initial pink armor with it. This time trying to be a little more careful to avoid the gold and white that I had already painted. I went back to the power packs and carefully picked out the trim and decorations with the Pro Acryl gold. I used the same technique as last time where I used this gold as a base coat and then over top that went with the gold speed paint. For the trim that runs along the top of the power packs, I only use the speed paint on the bottoms of it, which will help kind of create an artificial shadow and give it more depth. The little exhaust vents on the power packs felt like they needed to stand out a little bit more. So I grabbed another new Pro Acryl paint that I've never used before. This one was a nice off-white and I used that to paint all the vents with. It is still a white paint technically, so the coverage isn't perfect, but it went on much better than any of the other white paints I've used in the past. Thankfully, these were all small areas to cover, so it didn't take too long despite me having to paint 66 of these with 2 thin coats each. After that, I hit the side vents and the pipes with a dark gray to help break up the colors a bit more. Some of the power packs have these gross fleshy bits on them as well, so I wanted to give those a quick coat of white with some contrast dark oak flesh over top. I finished up all the gold and started painting in some bright whites into any of the parts that I plan to have a glow effect on later. The white will be a nice bright undercoat that will really make the ink stand out. Now that the power packs were done, I shaved off any paint where I wanted to add glue and finally attached them to the models. After seeing them fully assembled, I wasn't really vibing with the orange parts on the model. They didn't really match the reference images that I made before starting this project, so I wanted to try and correct that a bit. I grabbed some contrast paint ball red, the brightest red speed paint that I know of, and covered all of those parts with it. Thankfully, with contrast paints being semi-transparent, I don't feel like all of my painting was for nothing, since a lot of that will still kind of show through from underneath. Plus, with the original 3 colors acting as a base coat, I really only needed to go over it once with the speed paint, which saved me a lot of time as well. After finishing the Lord Exultant, I really liked how the ball red was looking on these guys, so I went down the assembly line again and did the same thing on the rest of the models. The red was much closer in tone to the pink that I used on the armor as well, which I think helps the gold and white pop out even more than it already did. I felt the pink needed one more little touch, so I grabbed the brightest pink paint I had, watered it down, and did some rough glazes over just the tops of the armor. I did one final wash of gold on the power packs as well, using the same red wash I used earlier. We're finally reaching the finish line. Only a few more quick steps left and we should be good to go. I'm planning to do a green glow on the swords, plasma, and the eyes. To start this, I coated everything all in titanium white. I did this with 2 thin coats with a brush. In hindsight, an airbrush could have worked for this as well, as any overspray would have just helped with the glow effect. The glow will be the last thing I do, as any overspray with the green I don't want to cover up by accident. So before doing that, I did some last minute purple wash on the red bits and started the base. I went for a more orangey Martian base for these guys. I airbrushed a really rich orange paint over all the rocks. Any overspray in the feet is totally fine, as it'll just kind of look like dust and debris getting kicked up on their armor. I tried to keep the spray mainly from the tops and the sides, leaving some of the primer still showing through underneath, and that'll kind of create an artificial shadow. It'll also contrast nicely with the bright orange. To highlight the bases, I used a desaturated orange to dry brush all over the highest parts of the terrain. Ultimately, I didn't really like the look of this color that I used, so I repainted over top of it and tried a new color. This bright orange had a much nicer tone and didn't contrast as heavily with the other one. Once that was good to go, I can finally put the finishing touches on these models. I grabbed a neon green artist ink and brushed it all over the parts I had previously painted white. Again, I could have used an airbrush, but I didn't want the overspray and glow effect to be super over the top for these guys. I didn't want to overpower the bright pink, so I kept the green mostly contained to just where I painted the whites. Since the green is an ink, it flowed really nicely into the eye lenses, which really helped save some time in the process. The plasma guns, tubes, and lantern thingies on their backpacks all got the same treatment. Finally, I loaded some green into the airbrush and did a very light dusting of it around the parts that I had just painted, kind of letting it spill over and create more of a glow look. And with that, the rims of the bases got a nice flat black and the models were finished. 3 months of painting. This was a project I wanted to get done within a week so that I could have it ready for game day. With any big project like this, that's just never how it goes, unfortunately. And I think this was kind of my first lesson in not to rush content, especially if it's really big, because you'll burn yourself out really quickly. That being said, I'm glad these guys are finally done, and I can start moving on to other smaller projects as well, because I have a lot of those planned, one of which is already halfway filmed, and that'll be the next video. Ultimately, I'm like 70% happy with these guys. I think because I got kind of burnt out, I just wanted to get them done, so there's still a lot that I want to do. I am kind of tempted to make a slight part 2 to this video in the future of me going in and touching up the areas that I want to touch up, now that I'll have more time and less burnout. I don't know if that'll be anytime soon, but I do want to do that at some point, I think that'd be kind of fun. I also do have Fulgrim, and I forget the name of it, but there's one of the other characters that can lead Noise Marines. I picked those up at the convention I went to in May, and they've been kind of sitting in my backlog since then, so I'd like to make a video at the very least on Fulgrim, maybe the other guy too, we'll see. But in the end, I got to try a lot of things with these guys. I went out of my comfort zone, which I rarely do, but I'm glad I actually got to this time. It was weird painting something, I guess, quote unquote, in the GW way, because normally when I paint, I tend to paint my miniatures almost like model tanks. Lots of oil washes and then airbrushing and then texture, as opposed to the typical, like, you know, base highlight shade method. And I think when I go back in to fix these guys, I might play around with some oils and grime them up a little bit. I also missed out on the decals and like there's just a bunch of stuff that I just didn't do on them that I really want to do. So that will be probably a video at some point. I do want to touch them up and make them a little more up to my standards, I think. All right, well, now that these guys are done, I can finally go back to filming other content. The next video should be another Space Marine one. I'm currently working on a character unit to lead the intercessors that I built in the first video. That's been a very easy, quick video to film, which has been really nice since it's just one model. So I'm gonna see if I can have that out either by the end of June or sometime in July, hopefully. I'm gonna try to stick to 2 videos a month now that I'm back from the convention. I don't know how long I can keep that up for right now, but I'll try my best. I at least want content coming out consistently, so. Now that these guys are done, I'm gonna take a break, go start filming another video soon, and I will see you guys in the next one.
And now, folks, we thank you for joining us tonight. We hope this evening was filled with love and entertainment, and that you happily sleep through the night and join us again tomorrow. Good night, and sleep well.